there actually is notable and noticeable impacts on math performance in classrooms that allow smartphones and other digital devices versus those that don't. We can see that kids are distracted not only by their own devices, but by the device of the person who's next to them, if they hear it buzzing or whatever it might be. We know that that's happening. We know that then it takes quite a long time to regain focus. We also know that kids are getting hundreds of notifications a day. You want to leave things up to parents. Parents know their kids best. They should be able to make decisions for their own children. That is a universal truth. But we also know that it's distracting not only their kid, but also other kids, that there is this real decline. Teachers have said that if there isn't a policy in place coming from higher up than their level of authority, that they're just not able to enforce it. And there's too many kids to stay on top of in the classroom, too many buzzing cell phones. And so that's when you think, okay, a ban in classrooms actually does make sense at the provincial level so that teachers can say, you know what, it's out of my hands. This is just the rule. Everybody has to follow it. A blanket ban makes sense. Because of the evidence we see, it's cut and dry that we need to have that put in place. When we look at our PISA scores, in terms of what are we getting for that money, our math, as a Canada average over the last 2 decades, from 2003 to 2022, math scores have dropped by 35 points. So what does that mean? Essentially, PISA characterizes a 20-point drop as a year of lost learning. So what that means is that over the last 2 decades, kids are almost 2 years behind where they were 20 years ago in terms of their math potency, their ability to do math. And reading dropped 21 points, so just over a year behind where they were in reading. This is not just a COVID thing. We know that COVID school closures were disastrous for kids, and I will report on that for the Fraser Institute. That is clear. There were big drops and mental health was affected, and there was all sorts of really terrible downsides for children who really faced very little medical risk from COVID. But this is not just that. This is actually even if we look at 2012 numbers, you could see that the trajectory was already occurring. You're already going in a downward position. So as we're spending more money, we're getting less. And that's when you get parents starting to want to explore other options.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley. What do you think about smartphones in schools? Should we ban them? Are they a problem? What do they do to kids? What do you think about school choice? Should we just support the public school options and really be contributors to the public school system? Or can we improve quality in public schools by allowing parents and students the opportunity to get education somewhere else? Finally, what is a quality education? What does it look like? Is it all just about facts, or is it all about skills, or is it something else? Is it about forming students into a certain kind of an adult? We get into all these questions and more with Paige MacPherson. She's the Associate Director of Education Policy at the Fraser Institute. She has her master's in public policy from the University of Calgary. She's been the Director of Canadian Taxpayers Federation for both Alberta and Atlantic Canada. She's consulted with the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. She's a former board director at the Canada Strong and Free Network, and she talked with us today from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Paige offers a wealth of experience, not just on education and education policy. It's something she's focused on from coast to coast, but she also has very interesting and deep insights on the conservative movement in Canada. So she shared her observations on the difference between a conservative in Atlantic Canada versus a conservative in Alberta. They're different. There are some similarities, but there are marked differences. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did, and I hope you find it educational. Please let me know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this content. I'd appreciate your support in that way. On to the episode. Welcome, Paige.
Thanks, Shawn. Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So I wanted to jump straight in. You have written lots and lots on education policy, and something grabbed my attention. I think you wrote about this last fall, but then we were also discussing it in our email exchanges, and it had to do with smartphones and school performance. And you put it this way, you said distracted, depressed, and declining results. And I wonder if you could unpack that for us. And is it really that depressing, or is there maybe something good about smartphones too? I don't know.
Well, I mean, certainly the positives, I think, are a little more obvious to us, right? We use our smartphones when we're trying to figure something out. It's a little encyclopedia in our pocket. The information possibilities with a smartphone are, we don't need to say it. They're there, and there are obvious benefits to that. And I think that is carried for teenagers and sometimes maybe kids as well, in that they can access this whole world of information. But where I think, quite different for children versus adults is just their capability of controlling themselves with it, right? The temptation, if they feel a buzz in their pocket, or if they know that something's there, pair that with the cyberbullying and just, normal kinds of bullying that every kid is going to experience as a fact of life that is now happening online, carried with them throughout the day if they have a smartphone. Their ability to not be distracted by that, the way that we might say, man, I'm going dark, I'm putting away my phone, I'm going to concentrate on something. That just doesn't exist. And I mean, you would know better than I would in terms of there's all kinds of biological reasons for that in terms of, the brain's development. But essentially, this is where it creates a real problem in the classroom, and where it's creating issues with academic performance because of the focus issue. But also on the mental health side, kids do report saying that they feel very attached to their phones, and that it's creating a lot of anxiety and even depression in some cases.
So this is where we jump from the hot issue, smartphones, and there's more we can say about it, to the political ideas behind it. So you've also put your mind to whether or not we should just ban them, and do bans work? And so what do you think about that? And is this a good idea? And is this a conservative idea? Is this an authoritarian idea? So where does your mind go to all the issue around banning smartphones?
It's a good question, because reflexively, I mean, I don't want to say that a ban is the best policy option at our disposal. We've seen in so many cases how bans don't really work. A black market is created. There's so many different examples of that, throughout history. I think where it's a little different is in certain contexts. So if we're talking about classrooms in schools, there are certain behaviors, certain things, certain items of clothing, certain things you might want to bring to school that we just say no. And I mean, I guess that is a ban, right? And what we have heard from teachers in classrooms is that they are these little tools of distraction. It's very difficult for them to regain control of their classrooms. We know the research that is reflected from a whole number of sources. Jonathan Haidt, who is an American, I believe he's a social psychologist, he is a wealth of information on this. He wrote the book, The Anxious Generation, which I would recommend to parents if they want to know more about this issue. And so he references much of the research on how it can take kids or students a full 20 minutes after being distracted to regain focus on something. So if you think about the length of a math lesson, for example, that you're not going to have a productive math lesson if you feel something buzzing in your pocket. And so that's where these sort of halfway measures, when we look at the policies, show that, well, if we just say out of sight, out of mind, it probably doesn't go far enough, just because we have the research to show, there's PISA data showing that, first of all, there's a high level of addiction to smartphones in kids. This is almost self-evident now. It almost doesn't need to be said, but there actually is notable and noticeable impact on math performance in classrooms that allow smartphones and other digital devices, personal, individual digital devices, versus those that don't. We can see that kids are distracted not only by their own devices, but by the device of the person who's next to them, if they hear it buzzing or whatever it might be. We know that that's happening. We know that then it takes quite a long time to regain focus. We also know that kids are getting hundreds of notifications a day on their smartphone. So we're not talking about a window of time where there is no digital distraction. We know this is happening in the classroom. And so that's where, you get to the questions around, okay, a ban, you want to leave things up to parents. Parents know their kids best. They should be able to make decisions for their own children. That is sort of a universal truth. But we also know that it's distracting not only their kid, but also other kids, that there is this real decline. And teachers need to have authority in their classroom. They need to have control over that. And those teachers have said that if there isn't a policy in place coming from higher up than their level of authority, that they're just not able to enforce it. And there's too many kids to stay on top of in the classroom, too many buzzing cell phones. And so that's when you think, okay, a ban in classrooms actually does make sense at the provincial level so that teachers can say, you know what, it's out of my hands. This is just the rule. Everybody has to follow it. A blanket ban makes sense. I think it's a little more complicated when you talk about bans on social media or something in general, which is, I think, where kind of are shifting to as a society. We are starting to have those conversations. But to me, the ban in classrooms, because of the evidence we see, is cut and dry that we need to have that put in place.
So I wanted to say, well, what are you doing with your kids? But don't answer that. Don't answer. So my kids are 1998 to 2004. Yeah, I've got 4 kids. And so they came sort of in high school age when we weren't really asking these questions. We weren't talking so much about addictions and distraction and losing our ability to actually learn how to focus on a book or on mathematics. And one of the things we found is that the teachers were insisting that our kids have cell phones. So if you want to find your assignments, you need to go on this particular website or this particular app. You need to have this app. In the last 5 years or so, it seems like there's been a shift. And I think more parents are starting to say, yeah, no, we're not doing cell phones. Certainly not before, 14 or 16. Are you seeing a shift from almost a universal acceptance of digital devices for young people, very young kids? And have people pulled back from that, or is that just my suspicion?
So I think that in terms of what the data show, the amount of kids who have devices is quite high. And I think that your intuition is right, that a shift is starting. I hope that you're right. What I will say is that there are more avenues parents can follow now if they don't want to give their kids a device or a smartphone and they want to opt out. So that is one thing that I would say is a positive. In terms of the data, I mean, just an alarming number of teens have their own smartphones, kids have their own iPads. It starts very young, and then sort of starts that addiction cycle, and it's difficult to break. And as you mentioned, there are those benefits, and there's a lot of parents who, for perfectly reasonable reasons, want their kids to have a device, whether they're they're going to swimming practice. I need them to let me know. I want them, in some cases, it's not even the helicopter parenting situation. It might be, I want you to have more independence. I want you to take the bus home by yourself, but I need to know that you're okay. And so I need you to have a smartphone, whatever it might be. So I think that, we are moving in this direction where we see all these positive, and then now it's become this sort of fact of life. And one thing that is really challenging, particularly in the teenage years, is that this is now how kids make plans with one another. And this is the thing that I hear the most often from my friends who are parents, is that if I don't allow my child to have a smartphone and an app like Snapchat or Instagram or whatever the app might be, it often seems to be Snapchat, they're not going to be able to make plans with their friends. And then they're going to be left out. And no parent wants that for their kids. Like, I think that friendships are extremely important, and I certainly try to foster that in my own kids. So it's not even just, they're not having that face-to-face interaction. They're spending so much time online, which is a huge problem. It's also when they want to have that face-to-face interaction, they want to make plans and have fun, and they're not able to do that because that means of communication is not there. So what you're starting to see now is a little bit of a resurgence of landlines. Parents are saying, I'm bringing back the landline. And this is great, I think, for reasons outside of making plans with friends as well. A lot of kids are not capable. We hear this from universities, from employers, that kids are just not capable of having that face-to-face conversation or picking up a phone. They don't check their voicemail anymore. And a lot of us are guilty of that as well. We've shifted to this sort of texting and emailing culture. And so getting that back and bringing back those social skills, I think there's benefits to that. There's also so-called dumb phones or brick phones that, were around when I was in high school, and now are coming back where parents actually have that option to. There's a lot more of this in the US, but you're starting to see the companies bring it into Canada as well, where they can actually just make sure there are no apps on it, or they can pick and choose which apps they want on their phone, or it can just be texting and calling. And so there are those avenues now. I will say with my own children that I have the luxury of them being younger. In some ways, it worries me because of AI, and I don't really know what the future holds with all of this stuff for my kids. But I'm hoping that the pendulum swings a little bit. So what we have done is no screens in our house other than TV. And that's sort of our rule. But my oldest is only in grade 3. So grade 3 really is the age where actually you start seeing this stuff now. So he's got some smartwatches in his classroom, which they're not allowed to have in school. Thankfully, in Nova Scotia, where I live, the provincial rules on this in elementary school are actually quite strict. In my kids' school is even stricter. And so that's a benefit. But you do start to see that, the smartphones and the smartwatches. So it's a difficult thing to navigate. And I'll just admit that I come from this position of privilege where I haven't had to really navigate it just yet. But our stance as a family is that we want to wait. So there's pledges now, wait until 8th in the States, and there's one called Unplugged Canada, and there's provincial factions of it as well, where you actually sign a pledge to hold off on smartphones until grade 8, and social media until age 16. And so that's really what we're sticking to, and hopefully others who are in my kids' social circles will do something similar, because that's what makes it tricky.
Yeah. So good luck controlling your kids.
I'm sure they feel deprived.
I shouldn't laugh too hard. I'm so sorry. I'm laughing at myself as I'm laughing. We tried everything to limit, and congratulations to you, I should say. I think you're doing the right thing. We tried to limit things and put internet blockers on and all this kind of thing, but some of our kids, my son especially, was just way too smart. He'd do a VPN and he'd get around it, and it is just, good luck with that, parents. And so you almost have to go to a point of, like you said, dumb phones, or not having the device at all, or not having Wi-Fi in your house, which is just brutal for modern businesses. But
Yeah, that would be really important. It brings up a problem that, is in classrooms as well, which is that, now we see that basically from grade 5 and up, students have a laptop that they use in classes. I have feelings on that. I'm pretty old school in my preferences about pen and paper and cursive writing and all that stuff. But this really is pretty much the norm. And schools put up these blockers, and they don't allow these different social media apps or certain websites. And kids are just so smart. They're just so digitally savvy, right? They're literate in this way, in a way that older generations are just not. And the change from, over 5 years is just insane. So kids really can get around it. They can use VPNs. And I think that it actually does lend itself to the policy discussions in the education K-12 space as well, because we need to be really conscious and intentional about tech, right? I think a lot of educational technology has just been introduced to classrooms, and kind of in what we were talking about before, where as a society, you're just moving in this direction, and it just seems like the right thing to do. And we need to prepare our kids to be future ready and all those buzzwords. But if we're not being intentional about it, at what point is it actually net negative? Does it actually take away from the educational experience and deprive our kids of the ability to hold focus and have those sustained thoughts and conversations? So it's not only in the home, it's in the classroom as well, but it's the exact same thing. Kids are smart, and we need to be a few steps ahead of them, which is really challenging.
Yeah, and they're motivated to find ways to get around our blocks. But so you're segueing a little bit into what is education. What do we expect out of education? Let's put a pin in that, and I'd like to end on that because it's kind of a positive note to end on. And I wanted to take a small aside. I wanted to tell you a story that Preston Manning shared, and I was asking him, "What is conservatism?" And you've circled around these waters in your professional work. And Preston said they had a conference. They asked people from coast to coast at this conference, all these experts, what is conservatism? And the East Coast guy said tradition, and Quebec said soft nationalism, and the guy from Ontario said business, and Alberta said revolution, and BC, they said polarization and being on the right side of the pole. And so when you're talking about how things are going in Nova Scotia, I couldn't help thinking of Preston Manning and that thought of tradition. So is that your perception of conservatism on the East Coast? Is that an overgeneralization? Perhaps it is. But I'm just wondering if you've spent your life in this world, what is your sense of perhaps some of the cruder differences between the Alberta vibe, shall we say, and the Ontario vibe and the East Coast conservative vibe?
So I'll preface by saying that I'm a big fan of Preston. My first job out of my undergrad was working at the Manning Center.
Oh, wow.
Canada Strong and Free Network, but was the Manning Center for Building Democracy, which Preston started. And so I will add that I think he's right about a lot. But I would say that he really does sum this up well. Here in the East Coast, I do think, first of all, it's certainly not revolution. And I have lived in Alberta. I absolutely loved living in Alberta. And culturally, I have a lot of respect for the sense of conservatism there and their sort of reflexive skepticism that, well, no, I think, let's consult with the people rather than just assume the government is right. Here you have a lot more deference to authority, and certainly tradition matters. But one thing that is very important, I think, in Nova Scotia is the sense of community. And which does exist, in different ways all across the country. I have lived all across the country, and so I have an okay sense for this. I think that in Nova Scotia and in Atlantic Canada more broadly, that connection to community, certainly not feeling like a global citizen, or sometimes you maybe a citizen of Canada as much as you are first a citizen of even your town or your community, your province. If you live in Cape Breton Island, you'll say Cape Breton Island before you'll say Nova Scotia. And so there is some overlap there with conservatism. I mean, I don't think that you have the skepticism of government here. You certainly don't, that you'll have out west. And so government solutions are embraced more often here. That's definitely just true. But at the same time, not relying on government and going to your neighbors and having that community problem solving does exist here as well, which is a really nice, beautiful thing. And then that sense of tradition, I would say, is probably the most unifying thing, that conservatism can lend to the culture here in the East Coast. And yeah, it's different, but I do think that, in an era of rapid change, it is something that is grounding and is a real nice benefit, that slower pace of life and that connection to tradition that really does have strong roots here in Nova Scotia.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. I love Preston also. I just think he's the best. I don't agree with him on everything, but even when you disagree with him, you can argue with him and it doesn't seem to fluster him at all. He's like, okay, well, you disagree and maybe I'll change my mind. He's just the best Canadian. I love him. I love him to bits. Yeah. Great comments on tradition as well. So you mentioned a deference to government solutions, and I'm going to use that as a pivot back to our discussion about education. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about educational choice and perhaps even whether the East Coasters would be as excited about school choice as people in Alberta or even in Ontario. So I wonder if you could share your thoughts on school choice and also throw in comments about the public school system itself. Are we getting value for money, and where's all the money going? Aren't we losing students? Isn't the student body shrinking, and yet we're spending more and more on school? So that's about 4 questions all at once, and you can take that wherever you want, and maybe starting out with the issue of school choice.
Sure. So on the issue of school choice, So there are cultural differences here. First of all, 5 out of 10 provinces do have school choice. And by that, I mean the funding of independent schools. So more specifically, parents, pay taxes, and that the taxes go to funding schools. All people pay taxes, and those taxes go to funding schools. So in 5 out of 10 provinces, which is BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec, some of that money will follow kids on a per student enrollment basis to an independent school of their choice, as opposed to just their local government public school. So the school that you would just, if you were going to do sort of nothing, just sort of choose the default option, your kid would go to their local government public school in the catchment area. There are different degrees of school choice in the 10 provinces. In Alberta and BC, for example, there are very clear commitments to loosening those catchment areas, meaning that even if you want to stick within the government public system, you can choose a school outside of your catchment area, really in any part of the province. If you want to go to a school across town, no problem, space permitting, you are able to do that because they have open enrollment policies. In provinces like Ontario and Nova Scotia, it's not that that's not ever allowed, but it is not a default permission. It is more difficult to do that. So the easiest choice, and by that I mean every other choice is difficult, is that you go to your local government public school. So where parents might want to choose an independent school for their child in the provinces that have no school choice, which is all of Atlantic Canada and Ontario, they just have to pay completely out of pocket for their kids' tuition, while of course at the same time paying their taxes and supporting the government public school system. Now, in terms of enrollment, I just want to clarify one thing, which is that enrollment is increasing. So we recently at the Fraser Institute put out a report. You are right that it has been decreasing in many provinces, but actually we've seen a shift. From 2013-14 to 2022-23, enrollment across Canada increased by an average of 5.6%. Only Newfoundland and Labrador saw a decrease of enrollment, 4.9%. So that actually has shifted in Atlantic Canada. We were definitely seeing decreases in enrollment, and that has changed. Those patterns have changed. And in terms of per student spending, total education spending in public schools in 2022-23 is $88.4 billion. So you're talking about a lot of money. That's an increase nominally of 40.3% over the last 10 years. So spending on government public schools is going up, and it's going up quite a bit. And at the same time, student results are going down. And I'll just note that when you inflation adjust, per student spending increases. So there are 5 provinces over the last 10 years, because of this big growth in enrollment and inflation, 5 provinces have experienced decreases: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland and Labrador, Manitoba, and Ontario. But we are still spending quite a lot per student, and overall spending is up. So when we look at our PISA scores, in terms of what are we getting for that money, our math, as the Canada average over the last 2 decades, from 2003 to 2022, math scores have dropped by 35 points. So what does that mean? Essentially, PISA characterizes a 20-point drop as a year of lost learning. So what that means is that over the last 2 decades, kids are almost 2 years behind where they were 20 years ago in terms of their math potency, their ability to do math. And reading dropped 21 points, so just over a year behind where they were in reading. This is not just a COVID thing. We know that COVID school closures were disastrous for kids. And, I wrote a report on that for the Fraser Institute. That is clear. There were big drops, and mental health was affected, and there was all sorts of really terrible downsides for children who really faced very little medical risk from COVID. But this is not just that. This is actually even if we look at 2012 numbers, you could see that the trajectory was already occurring. You're already going in a downward position. So as we're spending more money, we're getting less. And that's when you get parents starting to want to explore other options. We have these government public schools, which are very much one size fits all for kids. Maybe it doesn't fit your kid, and so you'd like to explore a different option. Well, if you live in Atlantic Canada or Ontario, you're going to have to pay completely out of pocket for that. And with the rising cost of living, and even before that, it was really challenging for a lot of families to do that. And that's why those policies of school choice, which in Alberta, they even go a step further and permit charter schools, which are completely tuition free for parents, but they're independently, autonomously operated outside of the government public school boards, but they're technically public schools. Parents have that option as well. There just are a lot more choices for families that don't exist in half the country.
You mentioned 5% growth in students, and then I was thinking, I wonder how much the teachers' salaries went up. You said students, parents are struggling to find options for their kids. And I'm wondering in your research whether you've noted or whether you have thoughts on the whole French immersion pathway and also the trend for parents wanting a diagnosis for their kids so that they can get an EA in the classroom and get an independent learning plan. Certainly in my past clinical work, it seemed like we were always getting parents coming in, often at the suggestion of the teacher, but often at the instigation of the parents, their own mom group. Has your research come up with any kind of data on those two issues, sort of the parents looking for options within the public system itself?
So let me address the compensation question first. It differs by province in terms of teacher compensation, but what I will say on average is that compensation remains the largest and costliest aspect of education spending, and which is sort of, okay, that makes sense, but it has also contributed the largest portion to the growth of total education spending in Canada. So this is not like, oh, we're building new schools and this, schools are so expensive to build. And that's the compensation, salaries, most of that, or pensions, whatever it might be, is the costliest aspect and the largest growth. So yes, take from that what you will. In terms of French immersion, so yes, it is often referred to colloquially as the private school within public school that parents like to opt for. And I think that it's sort of a reflection of constrained options. It's really not that different in terms of the pedagogical approach. The key difference is that there's a filter, right? So class composition does matter a lot in terms of student performance and outcome. Teacher quality matters a lot in terms of student performance and outcome. So if you have a class where there has been sort of a filter put in place, that is to say, parents have taken that step to sign their kids up for that option. It's not the default. You do have a bit of that filter in place. And so that's oftentimes what parents are looking for. There are challenges that come with French immersion. It's harder to help your kid with homework if you don't know how to speak French. Some kids struggle in French in subjects like math where they wouldn't have struggled if they had in English. So it's not a perfect solution, but I think it does reflect that. I'd love to. I haven't looked at an updated breakdown of the numbers of how many kids are going to French immersion and what that option is. That data is not very difficult to find, but I think that it reflects. To some degree, okay, parents want their kids to have this skill, but to some degree, it has to be that parents are looking for a choice, right? So in Ontario, you have Catholic schools, which are government operated, and then you have public schools, which are government operated, and then you have French immersion in both of those streams, and Francophone schools, as well as English schools. So there are some choices within the government public system, and families are going to exercise their ability to use some of those choices to choose the school they think is the best fit for their child. But if they truly had school choice, where we had something like charter schools or community schools, which were tuition free, and you decided that there was a really interesting way that you wanted to teach kids, or you saw a group of kids that you identified as struggling and you said, I'd like to create a school for those kids. Like, for example, the kids who are coming into your office and their parents want a diagnosis because they're not working well in the government public school system. They're seeking a diagnosis for autism or ADHD. Why don't we design a school that fits those kids better? And people are doing that. Of course, that exists. But if you want to pay out of pocket for that, and sometimes for, special education schools, there are some grants and stuff like that available. But for the most, in a province like Ontario and in Atlantic Canada, you are talking about paying out of pocket for those options. So if you were able to create that kind of a school and it was a charter school where parents wouldn't have to pay tuition to get their child to attend that, well, that would be a true avenue of choice, where they could take their kid out of that one size fits all system and put them into a system that actually reflects what they need out of the classroom without needing to be wealthy to do it, right? Or make tremendous sacrifices. And we have data on the families that choose independent schools for their kids. It's a total myth that these are all wealthy families. Actually, on average, in the provinces where we've looked at this, which is mostly in Alberta and BC, the family income is actually quite similar from public school to an independent school family. And oftentimes, families are just making tremendous sacrifices and choosing a different type of school that fits their kid better. It's not this sort of misconception of wealthy families sending them to these uniform prep schools, which exist. Of course, they're just a very small proportion of the independent schools on the landscape in every province that we've looked at these numbers in, which are multiple provinces of Canada. So I think it just reflects that parents really are seeking more choice, but they don't really have genuine choice when they're constrained in a province like Ontario. So they're just kind of doing whatever they can to find the best fit for their child.
Yeah. So on the issue of choice, I'm a firm believer that when it comes to service industries, when you're trying to help people solve a problem, or even if you're providing a product, choice drives quality. So if I know that I need to deliver great service to you, a great educational experience for your child, a great healthcare experience, or you will go somewhere else and I will go out of business, then I have to up my game. I have to be open late and I have to adjust to meet your needs. However, people can become a lot more demanding when they know that now they're in the driver's seat, right? And so there's this tension between wanting to offer choice, and I'm very much on the choice side. I think we need choice. It drives quality. However, we also need to protect the people who are offering choice from demanding, entitled, bullying parents, patients, people who are receiving these government services. And it gets into this weird situation where if you decrease the amount of service that you offer through the government option, the people receiving those services become more demanding. I want more for my kids. So they torture the teachers more, torture the nurses, the doctors, whatever service industry you're in, the police officers, they torture them more. And at the same time, the people providing the services aren't able to offer as good service as they would like because everything is constrained. It's a tension on both sides. And then you mentioned pedagogy. Well, one view of education is that it may not be very attractive. It's actually really hard. It's like learning to play the piano. The approach to education isn't always super attractive. I mean, parents like the outcome, but sometimes that process of a rigorous pedagogy isn't necessarily nice and fluffy and attractive. So have you wrapped your mind around this tension of needing to offer something that is a high quality pedagogy that might not be as attractive as something that's warm and fun for the kids, right? Your kid comes home every day, oh, I had the best day at school. Well, they might not be saying that if the pedagogy is hard. And at the same time, if government is contracting or limiting or constrained by how much they can offer parents, and at the same time telling parents that, well, these are your tax dollars, so parents can come in and torture the teachers and the administration. How do we solve that, right? I think you and I are on the choice side of things, but I'm not on the side of empowering entitled consumers of government services. So have you sorted that out? And maybe, again, I'm blending together 4 questions at once. So take it wherever you want.
Yeah. So practically speaking, in terms of teacher recruitment, we're having a big issue right now. There's teacher shortages really right across the country. Something's not working. We're seeing similar issues in healthcare, right? Something is not working. And these are not the ideal working environments. I think that is very fair to say. One of those things, you're talking about, back in the old days, discipline. I don't think we need to go there, but there is a problem where teachers are having a real challenge rather, gaining authority in their classroom. And that really does start from the teacher's college level. And one of my colleagues at the Fraser Institute, Michael Zwagstrom, who's a senior fellow of ours, is also a social studies teacher in high school in Manitoba. And when he went to teacher's college, he was taught to be a guide on the side rather than a sage on the stage. And that was kind of the philosophy, right? So you're helping students along with their learning journey. You're not standing at the front of the classroom and teaching them what they should know. And so it starts quite early in terms of the teacher's college and the education that pretty much all teachers in Canada need to receive to teach. There are very few exceptions to this in Canada. In Alberta, schools can apply to the ministry on a one-off basis to get people who are non-certified teachers to teach in their classroom. So if you'd like to get a carpenter to teach shop or a composer to teach music, you can apply for that. I think it makes a lot of sense. But there really is a monopoly over the teachers that have their B.Ed being in the classroom. So that sort of philosophical ethos is there. And then you have these surveys now where violence in school is out of control. The teachers' unions in all the provinces survey their teachers on this. And the survey results that I've seen is that, sometimes upwards of 90% of teachers have seen violence, and oftentimes it's against teachers. They're experiencing violence, or they've seen violence from students against their colleagues who are teachers. So there is a discipline issue there. And that's often actually a reason why families seek out private school, is they want more discipline for their kids. It's not that they want the soft, fuzzy, you're really nice sounding pedagogy. Sometimes, of course, that's what some families choose. But oftentimes families actually are seeking more structure. And you don't have to make, not a huge leap, right? We don't have to go back to the olden days. They just want something that is more structured. If my kid is misbehaving, I'd like you to them and tell them that they need to behave, have a consequence for that behavior. And likewise, if my kid is being mistreated by somebody else in the school, I'd like them to actually see a consequence so that my kid doesn't have to suffer that mistreatment again. And it really is that simple. And then classrooms can be a lot more orderly. But this is challenging when you have this model that we have in government public schools now, where you're trying to cram all sorts of kids into the same classrooms, even though we know that kids are different. And kids are different for all sorts of reasons, whether that's in terms of their learning or their behavior, their development. You're just putting all kids together based on their age, and you're passing them through. We don't fail kids anymore, right? There's no repeating a grade like when I went to school. That doesn't happen anymore. So you do have these challenges, and it's difficult for teachers. And parents are frustrated and teachers get frustrated. And so I think a lot of that is the result of that kind of one-size-fits-all model. And ultimately, I do think that this is something where, I think choice would help in that parents can choose. If they want something that is a different pedagogy, if they want a Waldorf school, a Montessori school, Reggio Emilia school, if they want a forest school, whatever, right? Parents should be free to choose that. And if they know that their child will flourish, or if that fits their values better as a family, likewise, if they'd like to send their kid to a Christian school or Muslim school, whatever it is, that fits their family better, and their kid is going to flourish in that environment, then I think that should be parents' choice. And if they want a school that is more traditional and more structured and has more discipline and has a more enriched curriculum, then parents should be able to choose that as well. I do think that would sort out a lot, because ultimately, if you're making that choice, there's an accountability mechanism there. The school, as you say, right, it's the same with the grocery store. If they're competing for your business, they need to keep you happy. But of course, we know schools are so much more than that. They're little communities, and parents become invested in that, in a non-financial way. And there is that nice kind of interaction that happens there as well. And that can really lead to student flourishing, I think. But then when it comes to, the vast majority of kids are in government public school. Even in the provinces where you have school choice, the highest proportion of kids that we have attending independent schools in Canada is about 13% of kids in British Columbia. So that's the max. In a lot of provinces, over 90% of the kids attend, well, in most provinces, attend government public schools. So ultimately, we do have to make sure that there is something that is high quality for those kids as well. If families want to opt out and they want to go their own route, I think we should enable it. But we need to ensure that our curriculum is rigorous and that we have standardized tests in place to make sure that we know that all the kids from all these different types of schools actually are receiving a quality education. In my view, the only way that we can really ensure that is by giving all kids the same tests at the same time on a level playing field to be able to track that. But our curriculum, there's a lot of issues. We've really moved away from high standards and really just content, facts, knowledge in general. We can talk about that if you wish, but it's we do have work to do on that to ensure that our kids are getting high quality education right off the board.
Yeah. So I'd like to definitely pivot to quality standards and content. But before we go there, the other side of entitlement is dismissiveness. And we see a lot of dismissiveness on the side of educators and healthcare providers, anyone in a government service position. And I wonder if the way out of that is by saying we're not going to fall for either that. We're not going to tolerate your entitlement, and we're not going to be dismissive of students or parents or patients. And that's not easy. That is not an easy position to take, where you have a boundary. I'm not putting up with your entitled attitude, and I have high expectations for your child, and I'm not going to dismiss you as being a problem parent, because it's easy to do that too, right? These problem parents, problem students drive you nuts. I wanted to end with a sense of what more could we get out of our education system, and whether or not you've turned your mind to that. How can we elevate the bar without making a whole bunch more angry parents or angry teachers too, right? It's harder for teachers if we demand that they do better. So where has your mind gone on the whole issue of quality?
Yeah. So I think that, what you're saying is it's a problem that many parents experience, right? They really don't feel that they have their voices heard. They don't feel they have any other options. Sorry, if your kid doesn't like the teacher that they have and the other class is full, there's really not much we can do, right? And so they're constrained, and that's really frustrating as a parent. And so if you look, literally, I put it to your viewers, listeners, Google any independent school, and I promise you, it will say on the website that one of their priorities is engaging parents and constant communication with parents, and they want to stay in touch. That is a big emphasis of basically every independent school in the country. And that's because that's what parents are looking for. They're going to make a sacrifice in some other area of their life so that they can financially afford to send their child to this independent school. They need to have their money's worth, and that a big part of that for parents is ensuring that the service is good, that their kid is getting a good quality education, and that their concerns, if they have them, are heard and addressed right away. And so we can, of course, put that back into government public schools, where parents are feeling that that's not the case. They want to have, I think, more communication with public schools, even something where, for example, we surveyed parents of K-12 kids in Canada on the topic of controversial issues in public school. So this is something that has come up. It's often in the news. It came up in New Brunswick, in Alberta. It's an issue that sometimes gets politicized because governments step in and they want to create policy around this. Because parents will come, their kids will come home having learned something very controversial at school, and parents had no heads up about it. And so we surveyed parents, and the overwhelming majority would like to have a heads up before their child is exposed to something controversial at school, whether it's in an assembly. Yeah.
What did you mean by controversial? Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's a really important qualifier. So we said issues about which there is no societal consensus. So whether that's issues around gender, sexuality, responses to climate change, those are the issues that we gave as the example in the survey that we did of parents, where we used Leger to do that survey. And the overwhelming majority of parents did want to have the heads up. Now, that doesn't mean that they want to opt their kid out. Now, a majority of parents in every province did say that they did want to be able to opt their kid out if they wanted to. But just giving parents the heads up. And you have to, wonder why parents aren't already getting a heads up about this stuff. And that's why those things make headlines. So even just that level of parent communication. But parents should also be well informed about what their kids are learning in school, about any sort of disciplinary issues that happen. So of course schools can, try to do their very best to make that a reality. That there has to be that level of transparency there. I think there also just has to be accountability mechanism, because how well your child's school is doing, parents shouldn't really be left wondering the answer to that question. So the Fraser Institute, we have a website, compareschoolrankings.ca, and that is, we look at the test scores of the provincial assessments in Alberta, in British Columbia, in Ontario, and Quebec. And we will show where your child's school measures up against other schools in their province or in their region. And so you can make an informed decision and take that piece of information and then go talk to your school's administrators or the teachers. But, we're not able to do that in provinces where there aren't provincial assessments, where the data is not good. And we are moving in that direction, even in some of the provinces that we do measure. For example, in British Columbia, where, there used to be more rigorous exams at the high school level, provincial exams that all students would have to take. They were meaningful for students, so they mattered in terms of the grade that you got. It impacted your course grade. It impacted your ability to graduate. That meant students actually cared about what grade they got on the test, which meant that they were motivated to actually demonstrate what they know on that, right? Now they've shifted to a lot more vague student assessments on numeracy and literacy. You're not testing course content anymore. So it's not really about what they know. These are now assessments of skill rather than knowledge. And they don't mean anything in terms of your ability to graduate or your course grade. So students are really not motivated to show up or to complete the test to the best of their ability, because they're just not mandatory. And that's in British Columbia. And so that's why, we could not continue producing our high school report card in British Columbia for that reason. So now we're only using the provincial assessments at the elementary level. And so as more provinces, and this is not just BC, this is a trend. We have looked at standardized tests, the number of tests, how meaningful those tests are for students. This is a trend right across the country. And so if we don't have these accountability mechanisms in place for students, as well as for teachers and schools in general and provincial governments to know that we're getting our money's worth out of this enormous investment that we're making in education, then it is, I think, difficult for parents to truly be empowered and truly be knowledgeable. And I think more information would help both sides, right? Teachers being able to demonstrate, no, we actually are doing a bang up job. Great. And here's the information, and parents being armed with that information as well, rather than just going in blind and angry potentially. So I think that's, a really good step forward. And then in terms of improving those, having the test to make sure that kids are doing well, but also I think we do need to look at the curriculum. And this is, maybe we can talk about this if you want in the last few minutes, but something I've been thinking a lot about is just the importance of knowledge in education. And the fact that our curriculum really has shifted away from that, from mandated course content to something a lot more vague, and leaving it up to teachers' discretion, meaning that if your kid is in one classroom with one teacher versus your other kid goes through the same grade, same curriculum in a different classroom with a different teacher, they could be learning something completely different. And that's something we saw when we did a review of the provincial curricula for history and social studies in British Columbia and Ontario. There's just not a lot of course content. They don't graduate knowing really much of anything about the history of Canada. And so those are conversations I think we need to be having as well.
Yeah. I agree that we need to expect more. But as you say that, I'm thinking, yeah, so I have to learn more about the longhouses and, the non-traditional healing mechanisms. Yeah. Yes, content, and what kind of content. So yeah, dilate on that. What do you think should be in the curriculum? Because that seems to be the crux of where a lot of the fighting starts.
Yeah, it does. So in terms of, we talked about our math scores and our reading scores, they're both down quite a bit. And so I think we need to look at math and reading as just a base level. If we have been teaching phonics for a long time in reading, we shifted away from phonics in the last couple decades to a cueing approach. And it has not worked well for a lot of students. And so, this is something, thankfully, that we have evidence on. We know sort of the science of reading, right? The science of how people learn to read. And it's something that just is not it. So this is something that is currently quite political. There is a shift happening. I think you are seeing some provincial governments here in Nova Scotia, for example, in the last few years, they did introduce some phonics back into the provincial curriculum. But before that, and even now, you do have teachers where they're sneaking phonics into their classroom because it's not in the curriculum, but they know this is what kids need to learn to read. It's absolutely ridiculous. So just ensuring, that your curriculum uses an evidence-based approach to learning, and uses the science of reading, for example, in the reading curriculum as a base level. That should be our expectation at the base level. There's no reason that any kid should graduate from a Canadian school, which, we do have the resources to make these some of the best schools in the world. And comparatively speaking, our PISA results are strong. We need to, but they're declining, right? So we need to, I think we owe our kids that. It's the same in math, right? We've shifted away from sort of the basics now. It's sort of, there was a great article in the Free Press the other day, which is Barry Weiss's outlet in the States. And if people aren't reading it, I totally recommend that they do because it's fantastic. And it's about someone who was a teacher at a very expensive private school in the U.S., who documents his experience teaching there and also touring schools for his own children that say very proudly that we don't do rote memorization in math. Like, oh, that's a faux pas, right? And as if, just committing content to memory is a bad thing. I mean, these are literally the foundational building blocks of knowledge and understanding. And then we can critically think about things or move on to higher order concepts, right? But you need to know things first. So I think that at a minimum, we do have to teach, math and reading in an evidence-based way. And then when it comes to courses like social studies and history, I think we do need to get back to having content mattering. And in my view, that would be, the history of our country. And so there is a lot of these, there are so many sort of high level discussions, that sort of play into this. Is there truth, right? Is it just your truth and my truth, or is there a truth that is a factual reality? And I think that, when you're writing a curriculum, acknowledging that there is a truth that exists and that facts really matter, is a really important starting place. But then also, there are questions around, are we global citizens or are we Canadian citizens? Stuff like that, right? So of course, teaching about the world is something that's important, but ensuring that kids have a real grounding in the history of our country. And then building on that from there, if you want to do a history of the world or, world religions or whatever you'd like to teach. But having actual content in place, as I mentioned, BC and Ontario, just not much content. And really the only emphasis that is consistently there, particularly in British Columbia, is past discriminations of Canadian governments. So yes, Canadian governments have committed discrimination in the past, and that is an important part of the history that we should learn, but it is not the only important part of history that we should learn. There's so much to that. And then when they're adults and they're, throwing red paint at statues and tearing them down and renaming streets and whatever it is they might be doing, at least they'll know what they're talking about, right? Because you're so susceptible to misinformation, and just not really being able to critically think about things or rigorously debate your ideas if you don't have that foundational knowledge in place first. So I would say we owe our kids that. And, if we had a longer time, we could talk about, well, should there even be a provincial curricula? Maybe there should just be standards, and maybe we should let schools experiment with their own curricula, and that's fine. But and I think that is actually a very worthwhile discussion. But for those kids who are, the 90+% of kids that are going to be educated in government public schools and are going to use the provincial curricula, I do think we owe it to them to have a rigorous and inspiring, rich, beautiful curricula that, inspires them to learn more and grounds them in a time and place that I think can improve their mental well-being as well.
Yeah, great answer. On the one hand, you're saying we need lots of content and rigor, and that's an essential feature of quality. So we need that content. And many of the words that you use just in those last remarks were about turning out a certain kind of adult, forming a certain kind of citizen. And I just had Yuval Levin on, and he wrote a book about institutions and how we need to be formed in order to be free. And I've already mentioned piano practice and, that education as being part of a formation of a piano player. And education and intellectual education turns you into a certain kind of a thinker. You're not born a fully rational being. Yes, you have reason, but that reason needs to be formed. Aristotle talked about the development of intellectual virtue through time and experience and effort. And quality is hard. And it gets back to the whole question of how do we advertise quality as being hard. And the other thought in that too, we started talking about cell phones and smartphones and how they shape us. So in the same way that a hard, rigorous educational experience shapes the kind of person we become, our technology shapes the kind of person we become as well. But anyway, so much we could get to. What keeps you awake at night? Actually, I asked one person that, and they said, "Oh, my 1-year-old daughter keeps me awake at night." Maybe that applies to you too. I don't know. But what worries you that we haven't asked about when it comes to education? And this can be politically, philosophically, whatever you want. Where do you think we're missing the boat, at least in our conversation so far?
Yeah. So, yes, first of all, my 4 kids are definitely what keeps me up at night for the most part. But I would say that what I really worry about, 3 of my kids are boys. And my worry is that school today is really not for boys, not designed for boys. And my guess is that, in your clinic, when you were seeing parents who were seeking diagnosis for their kids, a lot of those kids were boys. And I do worry about the pathologizing of normal boy behavior, especially in the younger year. And again, I mean, I do think that it gets back to that one size fits all. We're trying to cram everybody into this model. But a lot of the stuff, in schools that might have sparked boys' curiosity or joy or passion have been taken out, right? So kids can't write about anything violent in most schools. And that's not, of course, I'm not talking about violence against other students or anything like that. But, some of the great battles in history, for example, if you're not allowed to dig into, some of the age appropriate but exciting aspects of those historical stories, okay, maybe boys who are a little bit more motivated by that kind of content are not going to be as engaged in history. If you're not going to let boys, and lots of girls who I think would fit into this as well, but adventurous kids, climb trees, have snowball fights, play contact sports in gym. I totally understand as an anxious Jewish mother, the genesis of, scaling these things back. I totally get it. And I don't want my kids to be hurt at school, and I don't want the encouragement of violence or anything like that. But I do really worry that we have designed schools in such a way that is a perfect fit for the rule-abiding, standing in line or circle time type of girl, and that boys are struggling. And this is anecdotal. I mean, there is some evidence on it, not in my own research, but I mean, lots of other people have written about this. But anecdotally, the other boy moms that I talk to, it's almost a universal experience. And there's just these constant reminders that you have to give your boys about, like, when you're getting fidgety or you want to be moving, or, just make sure you write about friendship and not fights and stuff like that. And I think it's really important that, in this effort to be more inclusive of girls, which we have made great strides on, as a society, that we haven't excluded boys. And I think we need to be a lot more mindful of that, especially in this age of diagnosis of kids, and medicating kids as well. I think we need to be really mindful of that. And that's, I guess, as a mom of 3 boys, one of whom is already very active, that is something that keeps me up at night for sure, when I'm not already being woken up by a child for some other reason.
Great response. And that could be a whole episode unto itself, talking about the breakdown, male-female breakdown in secondary education too, right? It's all the women who are doing the masters and the PhD programs, and guys are being told they're losers. Now, is it the fault of the system? Is it the fault of the boys we're raising? I don't know, but boys are different, and that's a very provocative thing to say nowadays, that guess what, boys and girls, they tend to be different, and girls are good at school, though.
I get it because, when I have my daughter say, why don't you go color? She'll just color. Great, right?
Yes. And do it well. She'll do it well, too.
Well, what? Right? As a teacher, I get, I'm not a teacher, but I get why a teacher would say this.
Yeah.
But we do have to make sure, and also why it would be so challenging to be teaching rambunctious boys as well.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Totally understand. But we need to make sure that boys are not being excluded. I see so many boys that are told, oh, just, school's just something you got to get through. And I just think kids really deserve so much more than that. They need an education them where they're at and motivates them and inspires them. And I think that's part of the reason why, I'm speculating, but why you're talking about those higher university degrees, why they are now dominated by women. In so many fields, postgraduate. So I think that, if we get starting, we need to explore that.
Yeah. Paige, this has been fantastic. You know so much about education, and you've thought deeply on it. And then you've also traveled in conservative circles and political circles. And so it's really neat to see you weave those together. I can't thank you enough for spending the time here today.
Yeah, I'm so grateful too. I really enjoyed this conversation. So thanks for the opportunity.
Oh, my pleasure. Talk soon.